because of Freedom of Information Action. And this scientist used to constantly say, I've never taken money from Monsanto. I don't work with Monsanto, I work independently. Well, it turns out Monsanto was paying him. And not only was Monsanto paying him, Monsanto's PR firm, the public relations firm called Ketchum, was writing his articles. And one of these articles that was being written was, it's a graph saying, genetic engineering is exact because it works with 3 genes. Well, what are the 3 genes? The gene you shoot, which is the toxic gene, and you shoot it with a gene gun, an antibiotic resistance marker, viral promoter. Why do you need antibiotics resistance markers? Because you don't know if your shooting is working. So, in order to identify the cells that absorb the gene from the cells that didn't, you put an antibiotic resistance marker, then pour an antibiotic on the Petri dish, and the cells in which the new gene didn't get introduced die. So then you multiply the cells in which the toxic gene got added. Why do you need viral promoters? Because all life forms are intelligent, down to the cellular level. And they reject that which is not part of their organizing. So just like when there are organ transplants, there's a tendency to reject the organ and lots of medicines have to be given. When a gene is introduced, there's a tendency to silence it. And so the viral promoter pumps it up for expression. So every step is the unreliability of the technology. And yet Volta says, this is accurate because we work with 3 genes. And normal breeding works with all the genes. Well, that's the whole point. Just like in real democracy, everyone's voice counts. In the democracy of life as self-organization, all the genes and all the cells count. They're doing something. They're active. But the worldview on which GMOs are based is the idea that life is a machine. It's dead matter. It's like a Lego set, you can move things around. But life is intelligent self-organization and self-regulation. And when you rupture through forcing genes that don't belong, the regulatory processes start to get disrupted. There's a recent study done by someone I know from MIT. And what he did was he started to hear from scientists that GMOs were accumulating formaldehyde. Now, I only have a memory of formaldehyde as the liquid in which you keep lab specimens, you know? Turns out formaldehyde is produced in plants, but it's immediately reabsorbed in a regulatory process. So it doesn't accumulate. In GMOs, it's accumulating. And more than 1,000 studies have shown it. More than 1,000 studies. So there's proof that the regulatory processes within an organism are being disrupted. It also shows that the idea on which the entire non-regulation of the United States is based, that idea is called substantial equivalence, is a false idea. Because if a plant regulates the formaldehyde and a GMO is not able to regulate the formaldehyde, the two things are different. But in any case, the same companies and the same governments treat a GMO as a new invention, different from anything in nature, different from anything done by farmers, when they claim intellectual property. It never existed in nature before our invention. And then when people say, okay, tell us about its safety. It's just like nature. I have called this ontological schizophrenia. Because how can the same thing be novel and not novel? How can the same thing be natural and not natural? And this again is part of that split of when it comes to privatizing profits, then we'll claim it's not natural. And when it comes to shedding responsibility, you say, oh, farmers have always done it, nature's always done it, we are doing nothing new. Now I'll share with you briefly how you got non-regulation in this country on GMOs and why it took counties like your county to say no. There is an international treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity. Just like there's a climate treaty to find solutions to climate change, there is a biodiversity treaty to stop the erosion of species diversity. And both these treaties were signed at the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. My government had asked me to advise it on the Biodiversity Convention because I was already saving seeds from 87 onwards. I was already working on biodiversity, biotechnology, so they asked me to help, and I did. And we managed to get into that treaty an article called 19.3 in which we said all impacts of genetically engineered organisms, called GMOs, which is not very accurate, that all GMOs must be assessed for their impact on the environment. And the new language we created in that treaty was biosafety. There's all kinds of safety, including in food, but biosafety is the particular safety issues arising from genetically engineered crops and food. This is a law. It then became a protocol, and I was appointed by the UN to be part of the expert group to make it. There's an international Cartagena protocol requiring governments to look at biosafety. It's that protocol that has allowed governments to be GMO-free across the world. Because senior President Bush stomped out. I was there in Rio. He stomped out and said, I'm not going to allow my $50 billion biotech industry to be destroyed because it only existed as long as you can have monopoly rights through patents and no safety assessment. You implement biosafety and the recognition that seed is not a machine, but self-organized evolution. Those two basic scientific issues and democratic issues, you put them together, you don't get a GMO. No one will adopt a GMO. No government will adopt a GMO. So President Bush walked out, said, I'm not going to sign this treaty. US hasn't signed this treaty yet. Came back and told his vice president, and I'll never forget this. This vice president's name was Dan Quayle. And Dan Quayle went all over the world, the news about him not being able to spell potato. You remember? But Dan Quayle, who could not spell potato, could spell substantial equivalence, much more complicated word. There's a very, very good film made by a French filmmaker whose title is The World According to Monsanto. Her name is Marie-Monique Robin. She's also written a book that goes with it. It's That Fat. And the book is entirely based on public domain data. One of the scenes in that film is President Bush visiting Monsanto headquarters. This is before Rio, saying, tell me what you want to do, and that'll be law. So, even before WTO, even before 95, Monsanto was writing US laws. Then it started to write global laws using the US government, and it is continuing on that. When corporations write laws, democracies stop to exist. And it's only when we start to reclaim democracy by writing our own laws, which is what you're doing with your charter, that democracy gets born again. And today, it has become so important because the consequences of corporate rule are nothing less than species extinction, extinction of our species, nothing less. I've worked now 30 years on issues of agriculture. It isn't the subject I chose. I mean, I was passionate about physics. I studied quantum theory, and I mean, even to now, you know, sometimes see a paper, I get nostalgic, but then I say, no. The earth needs your service. And over 30 years, I have found that every claim of industrial agriculture is a false claim. It begins with saying we produce more food. Industrial agriculture has never produced more food because it never produces food in the first place. It produces commodities for trading, and commodities don't nourish us. And because commodities don't nourish us, they end up actually destroying our health, which is why there's such an epidemic of food-related diseases. And because the US had had the longest period of commercial use of GMOs, if you were to take new disease epidemics, the highest are in this country. Literally, the freedom of corporations like Monsanto to make profits is at the cost of our children to be healthy. It's at the cost of the planet's health. And the price is becoming too heavy. You know, I don't mind giving a little concession, say, okay, some profits, all right. But these are obscene profits because they are being extracted through processes of ecocide when it comes to the planet and genocide when it comes to people. Ecocide basically means the crime of destroying ecosystems, species, the soil, the atmosphere. Wherever BT crops or Roundup Ready crops are used, the soils are dying. Wherever. Wherever they are used, pollinators are dying. The Roundup Ready use killing the milkweed, which is where the monarch butterfly nests, that evidence is out. But long ago in Cornell, there was a study where they fed the monarch larvae GM corn pollen and non-GM pollen. The larvae that ate the non-GM pollen did fine. All the butterflies that were fed the BT corn larvae died. Early studies were showing us this. Destruction of diversity of species at every level, within the soil, above the soil, plants, beneficial insects. Pesticides had begun the problem. And I, in fact, prefer to call GMOs poison-producing plants. Because the industry actually, you know, they have an organization. The poison industry has an organization called Crop Life. Literally. All the pesticide industry gets together and they call themselves the Crop Life Association. And it's this association that threatened Michelle Obama when she started an organic garden in the White House. They wrote to President Obama and said, this is sending a bad message. Well, you know, if every message from life is a bad message, you will choose death, which is what the Monsanto choice is. So ecocide is there in every study that we're seeing, but not just studies, indicators. I mean, look at what's happened to Argentina. Look at what's happened to Brazil. My country, the only crop they managed to push through was a cotton, BT cotton. There is not a single pollinator in the BT cotton plant. Not one. We're doing a study on the soil. The bacterian population is 250% less than the organic. And it's declining. Every year it's declining. And why do I call it a genocide? I call it a genocide because never before have seeds been the reason of wiping out hundreds of thousands of farmers. Seeds have been the source of life. Every culture has said you've got to save the seed. You've got to save the seed so that the future is guaranteed. And there's a very famous story from the history of my region. I come from the Himalaya, from Doon Valley. I was born there, I've returned there to do this work, start the farm, start the Earth University, and in fact I've left my colleagues. We have 50 participants studying agroecology and organic farming right now. I've left them to be with you because I just feel so deeply that what you do in California is significant for the US and for the world just now. So, in our area in Dehradun, we have replanted diversity. We grow more than 2,000 crop varieties that we've saved. We've created 120 community seed banks. We call them community because we believe seed is a commons. And in this region, in the 1815, when the British came and there was the wars and the typical things that happen, people in the villages died of hunger. And yet, in every home, you know these squashes that you have? The squashes are used as seed containers in the high mountains. They're called tomris. Every tomri was full. People did not touch the seed, because to destroy seed is sin. And now there's a deliberate destruction of seed. There's a deliberate destruction of seed